Well, thank you very much for being able to be here and to join this important discussion. First, I can say that now there probably isn't so much of a difference between Denmark and Sweden as there were before. We are only 16 kilometers from Sweden here, so the southern part of Scandinavia is at a close distance. And the fact is that discussions probably make that you tend to combine your views. So we have now current Danish recommendations which are not so different from the Swedes, so I won't actually spend much time on that. If you want to read more about the Danish history in this respect, I can recommend this supplement. So I'll take the privilege to discuss this in a little bit broader sense. So first, this is where we are. 2019, and we were not here in 1856 or in 1890. On top you can see this is the Copenhagen city at that time. Population was not 1 million as it is now, it was 150 million increasing to 150,000 increasing to 400,000, but living in this quite close area. This was a fortified city of the time of medieval, of that time in Europe, so this was not as strange. And during this period, the city spread beyond the defense works. What's important is that you can read here in 1837, the royal coroner of Copenhagen, he said it was really not a medical issue that infant mortality was 25%. It rose to 25% during this early stage of industrialization. He was not a dumb, because he was very well educated in Paris and been to Vienna, and he was quite advanced in urban hygiene. We had the early waterworks at that time. We had a cholera epidemic some 10-20 years earlier. So it was certainly not because he was not quite aware of bacteriology and medical, the importance of medical prevention, but also medical services. But when it came to infant mortality, he said this is not really a medical issue. And here Anne Lykke, who did her thesis on childhood death in Denmark, said in usual thinking it was as natural that children were dying from childhood as old people were dying from old age. And incidentally, my mother's father was born in 1878. My mother's mother was born 10 years later. She was 1 out of 8 children, and only 4 survived. And that family obviously grew up and were very well functioning and happy and so on. So, and it's interesting to be here and discussing a problem which is of the same nature, and yet so radically different in just 120 years. And I don't need to say too much at this stage about we are here in Scandinavia, but the world is bigger than this. So you can say there is a problem here that the human existence started with a fertilized egg. That is our genetic individuality is defined, and then there's some rapid cellular transformations, and then we have a fully formed fetus where you can say this is a human fetus, it's not a fish, it's not a monkey. Then there's this kind of question of viability which you're discussing here, where we can say this could be a criteria for saying now you are a human being. And then there's self-consciousness, which in philosophical sense usually is argued as one reason why human life is different from other life. Although now we know that the great apes and quite some other animals also, they do have self-consciousness by the way we test this. And then there is, you can say, the final stage of humanity, that's the ability to see the other as another human being who is not yourself, who have other aspects, other characteristics, other wishes for his life, and you have this a mutual relation with others as being different, difficult and interesting. And some people may not really reach that stage. And then you can say, what are the motives to support the life of children? You can say, first you can say it's an absolute. It's an absolute. There's the sanctity of human life, and the Catholic Church obviously maintains that point. The Pope will say human life from the fertilized egg, that is a full human female, that needs full protection. Abortion you shouldn't do. But you can also say that the humanity project, the humanistic project, has formulated more or less the same human right. Once you are a human person, you have full rights regardless of your size and color and age or sex or whatever. So anything else is discrimination. So you could say in that perspective, not treating any human life as a full individual with all rights, that's discrimination. And I think actually that this Swedish, Danish, Norwegian neonatal project comes from that kind of thinking very much. I mean, this is a question of rights. But you could say there are also rational reasons to support the life of children, and you can say this historical example of 25% infant mortality, that was seen as natural. It was probably also at that time seen as beneficial in the sense that this was just the early loss of life which was not worth living. But now we know obviously that those 25%, most of them, because we are some of them, have survived and done pretty well. And actually this city also holds the history of a king who made a hospital with free care for the population of Copenhagen in the human capital view. I mean, that was his sovereignty. And this was his workforce, and that was his potential soldiers. I mean, this was a value, an asset to the society. So you can say there's an investment. This is the idea of the human capital, and there are lots of human capital thinking when we think of health of children and education of children. Clear. But there's also a rational argument, which is as a citizen, because we have a club. The club means that if you are inside this club, then you deserve to be treated well, and if you're outside, then it's a different question. Whenever there's an accident, an incident or catastrophe somewhere in the world, the Danish press, as one of the first sentences, we will know whether there was a Dane there or not. Just expressing this fact that we are sort of treating ourselves in a kind of a mutual responsible relation, and children enter that relation at a certain stage and thereby then deserve full services. And then there's obviously also rational causes, and then there's the instinctive causes, which is what we see every day when we deal with this, where parents will just say, do something. And we also say it ourselves, and we see the hands and the face and the fingers, and then we say we have to. I mean, it's not a question of you can't think about it, it's emotional, it's instinctive. And Ulrike already showed this curve. The mean IQ as a function of gestational age. I put it here together with a photo which is in the same publication by Hugo Lagerkrantz, and the title is The Heart Problem. Hugo's idea is that if you could ever make a test of the brain, we could sort of discriminate the brain who is able to house a conscience from a brain who's not. And if a brain is not big enough, complicated enough to house a conscience, then it's not a human being. I mean, I think it's a little bit too theoretical. I don't think that will ever work. But I mean, the hard problem is that the smaller they get, the less sort of, the closer to the fertilized egg, the further from that person, which we usually. And the other part of the hard problem is it becomes harder and harder for us to succeed. So there is a gradual problem here. There is a line who has to be cut somewhere, and this is. It's not a classification problem, it's the delineation problem. And then I come to my personal reasons. I think using fixed gestational ages are a little bit stupid, or I think it's quite stupid. It's clear it works. I mean, you can make a guideline based on gestational ages, but first, we don't know it. Incidentally, if you're born in Denmark, you will be a couple of days older than if you're born in Sweden, because we use different reference curves for sizes. There's obviously a big variability in maturation. We know that whenever as a pediatrician that a child of a year can be walking and talking, and another child can hardly stand, and yet they can still do well. And then there are other clinically important factors. There are those who are easy, growth restriction, difficult deliveries, difficult pregnancies, and there are also those who are not so easy to deal with, gender, for instance, sex. But still they are very important statistical traits. And then there are certainly other very important competing interests. A child is born into a family. It's not that only that child's future, it's a family's future. It's a future children's future. They may not never be born. I mean, there's a lot of reasonable, which in each case is different. And if you try to sort of take that out of the equation by making a guideline, I mean, and then you say the guideline is only a guideline, but as Stephen already said, guidelines work because these are unpleasant decisions and therefore, well, we just stick to the guideline. Got it. Some empirical Danish data on ethical judgment. This is a bit old, but I think still they are valid in some respect. The first, you see, published in '98. This country, we have a serial registration number system. That means you can pull a sample to send a questionnaire, which will be random. People with the age of 18 to 45 were chosen because they were potential parents. And they were sent this questionnaire with a scenario. Could we start mechanical ventilation shortly after birth because of respiratory distress syndrome in such a 24-week-old baby? Chance of survival 40. Probably it would be somewhat better now. If the baby survives, risk of serious handicap is 30. Not so different. And then in one scenario, which was answered by about 300 people, the parents urged that the baby be treated because they're no longer young, and that pregnancy was a result of fertility treatment. And out of the 300-something Danes, 3/4 say go ahead, 1/6 said don't, and those in between said we can't really decide. I mean, we have doctors to take that kind of decisions, or we need to know all these other aspects you were talking about. Then in another scenario, with the same sort of biomedical situation, the scenario was now the parents are young, they don't really know what to say, the pregnancy was unplanned, you envisage there are several other, perhaps better children waiting in their life. And here, another, because this was the design of the study, so this was just a parallel group, but because of the size, the difference is obviously quite clearly statistically significant. Now a much smaller proportion said go ahead and a larger proportion said do not. And this means that at that time, at least in this country, people judging would consider parental expressions of interest, but perhaps also parents' objective interest. Another piece of research, about 2,000, again randomly drawn Danish citizens were asked to say something about what they think should be provided by the tax-financed, free access, equal access healthcare system. And there was an overwhelming support for this life-threatening illness in children and young adults, and also for adults. The politicians, the 270, the politicians, by that time, these was exactly the people who were sitting in the boards, the political boards, who were sort of deciding on how to spend the healthcare money in this country. And you see, they were slightly less positive, probably because they were sitting and having the problems of making them the money fit. I mean, limited budget, many things you want to do. But the important thing here is that these are the children and young adults, and there was a question, intensive care of extremely preterm infants, formulated as, I was not involved in this research, but somehow they decided to formulate that as a specific question. And here the extremely preterm infants are well, it was then now not 98%, but it was 76%, and actually a politician it was 1/3. And much closer to treatment of infertility. Seeing probably this as being the needs of the parents and not the right of the child. And these were Danish politicians elected for taking care of our healthcare system some years back, 20 years back. But I mean, probably what we think has not changed so much. What we say may have been changing more, but what we think may not have been changed so much. Then I'll say a few words on economy. I'll say this because This is Dominic Wilkinson, who is, some of you may have known, heard or know better than I. He's a medical ethicist, professor of medical ethics in Oxford. He's also an intensivist, a pediatric intensivist, and he said the problem with these discussions about limits of possibilities that you say it's futile, and the parents would ask, but is there really no chance? And they'll say, is it 1%? Then we say, go for it. But what you can't, and some parents will even go for 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 10,000, but what you can't make go away, that is the money you spend on this, you cannot spend on something else. So that's what's called alternative cost. And the problem in our society, and I suppose actually in all societies, that there is other good money, good use of public money. Education, if you want to do something good for children, then educate the girls. I think this is all over. Social security, if you want the society to have coherence. Environment, big issue. Well, international safety, culture, law and justice, you can't have a society where, yeah, I don't need to say more. Yeah, and in our context, and probably in university context, is obviously what is the chance of survival, how long do they don't survive, how long do they live. There's much evidence to suggest that what we also have achieved is that we have delayed the death of those who die anyway. So to induce more suffering and higher costs. Long-term dependence, clear, very expensive. Work capacity, I put in parentheses, there's no question it's an economical argument, but ethically we really try to avoid speaking of treating people different according to whether they can get working and contributing or not. But in economical terms, no question it's a factor. And then there's a technical issue about interest rate. We're dealing with children, they may live for 70 or 100 years, and that depends very much on technical, the interest rate or the discount rate, and all the economical calculations depend heavily on these, and that is assumptions. And then finally there is an issue about who actually pays. And I just have this as a next to last. This is a study from India, where this was a mission hospital, so that was free medical care, but the problem was to parents there living in a major city. Their parents typically living in the countryside, having a dependent child would influence their life enormously. And therefore this is based on the parents' perspective on being able to support a child who would not do well. Yeah, and this is just a quote. I think my point is that as doctors we have our obligations. We probably have the somehow swear a Hippocratic oath, but that is really not saying that we should save any life. It says that we should use our skills and knowledge with carefulness and compassion, and to serve society and our fellow men. That's the translation of the Danish version of the Hippocratic Oath. So I think it takes, a little bit also of a bigger view to decide on this issue. Thank you.